Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Quest and Dialog system in Godot 4 and GDScript. In this video, we will start by creating our dialog system, and we will start by focusing on our dialog resource and our JSON file, which will hold our dialog data. If you've never made a dialog system before, you might be unfamiliar with the concept of dialog trees and branches. So let's explore these concepts using a little scenario. Imagine you are Patrick Starr, and you recently got employed at the Krusty Krab restaurant, and you were put in charge of the phone. So if a customer calls, you need to pick up the phone and take their order. The phone, in this case, represents our dialog tree, as it gives us the opportunity to have multiple conversations. So, the first time the phone rings, you answer, "Hello?" only to be asked, "Is this the Krusty Krab?" Confused, you respond with, "No, this is Patrick," and you hang up the phone. This entire conversation that just happened before you hung up the phone represents the first dialog branch in our dialog tree. This branch is defined by its unique sequence of exchanges, aka, "Hello, is this the Krusty Krab? No, this is Patrick." Okay, so the phone rings again, and this time, slightly puzzled, you answer, "Who is this?" The caller repeats, "Is this the Krusty Krab?" And you, now frustrated, insist, "No, I told you, this is Patrick," ending the call once more. This is the second branch of the dialog tree, which could only be executed after the first branch has been explored. So this entire conversation could not have happened if that first call hadn't occurred. Now, let's consider a variation. If the caller initially asked, "Is this Patrick?" instead of, "Is this the Krusty Krab?" what would have happened? Well, the entire state of the first branch would have changed, potentially leading to a new third branch where you respond with, "Yes, this is Patrick. Who is this?" instead of directly going to the second branch. Each state influences the direction and outcome of the conversation, which is the dynamic nature of dialog trees. So what I'm trying to convey from this example is that our dialog trees hold all of the conversations for a particular NPC, and our dialog branches hold all of the data for these conversations, including their state, responses, and text. Okay, so let's further explain as we go along. Go ahead and open up your project, and in our file manager, we'll create a new folder called Resources. This is where we will store all of our non-scene or script related resources. In this folder, let's create another folder called Dialog. This is where we will store our non-scene or script-related dialog resources, such as our JSON file and our resource object. We will use JSON for our data file to hold our dialog trees and branches for each NPC. If you've never worked with JSON before, it basically allows us to read and write data in a human-readable way, and then machines can parse this data that we wrote to generate or store content. JSON files are formatted in a key-value-par manner. The key is usually the name of the data, and the value is the content of the data. Each key has an assigned value, and this value can be anything from a string to an array to an integer, etc. Don't worry if this is a bit confusing, it will all make sense in a bit. So let's create a new file named Dialog Data, and it should end with .json. In our newly created file, let's create a key for each of our NPCs. This key should be equal to the NPC ID that we will give each of our NPCs. I will be creating two NPCs for our system, so my IDs will be NPC1 and NPC2. I will assign these IDs to them later on in the main scene via the inspector panel. So we've defined two keys, and these keys have the value of our NPC ID. Now we need to give it a value. This dialog tree will contain our different dialog branches for each of our NPC. Like I said, each NPC will have a tree to hold multiple branches or conversations. Each branch will hold all of the possible dialogues, responses, and states for that conversation. The branch will be identified via a unique ID, and depending on our dialogue state, our tree will play the correct dialogue from the correct branch using this ID. Okay, so you can see that my first NPC has three dialog branches. So it's the first dialog branch, the second dialog branch, and the default dialog branch. My second NPC also has three dialog branches, dialog branch 1, 2, and the default branch. You need to make sure that each branch ID is unique and that you can easily identify them. Now, you'll see each branch has an empty dialogs array. For each dialogs array, we need to create our different dialogues that will be available at that branch. Each dialog in this branch will need a state, text, and a map of options. Our state identifier will represent the state of the dialog, as well as the state that our dialog branch needs to be at to play that dialog. Our text will contain the dialog line that is going to be spoken by the NPC, and our options field will map our possible player choices to the next dialog state. Let me just zoom out a bit. Okay, so that was a lot, but as you can see, my first NPC has multiple branches. Now, I only populated our first branch with a bunch of dialogues that have different states. So when we first interact with our NPC, it will play the dialogues associated with the first branch in the tree for that NPC. The dialogue that it plays from this branch will depend on the state of our dialogue. So, when we first talk to our NPC, it will play the first available branch in our tree. By default, the dialogue that it will play within this branch will have the state start. This dialogue with this state is usually the introduction to the story, dialogue, character, and the first quest. When we make certain decisions, the dialogue will change its state and our conversation will move down to the next dialogues that are available for that branch. If we've gone through all of the dialogues of the first branch, meaning we finished the first entire conversation, then it will move on to the next available branch for that NPC, which is usually the next conversation, such as the person continuing a story they were telling you, or them just asking for your help again. If all of the branches have been moved through, then it will play the dialogue from the last branch, which contains the default branch, which is usually something random like, "It's cold today, isn't it?"
Flying, flying in the sky, cliff racer fly so high.
Let's focus on our NPC's tree again. So as you can see in my NPC1's dialogue tree, I have a branch that contains a set of dialogues for when we start the dialogue, have started the dialogue, when we ask for quests, and when we reach the end of the dialogue, and when we exit the dialogue. Each of these states have a text and a set of options. Each of these options have a text, such as ask about town, receive quests, say goodbye, and these text is what will be displayed to the player on the UI, and the value, such as in progress, give quest, and exit, is the value of the next state of the next dialogue that should play when we choose this option. When we end or exit the dialogue, we have no options because both will close the dialogue panel, with the difference being end will move on to the next dialogue branch and exit will simply exit the dialogue, and if we then interact with the NPC again, it will pick up where we left off in the current branch. Now I've only added my first branch for my first NPC, and to add more branches is a lot of work. So I'm going to copy over my existing JSON file, which I pre-created, and you can find this file to use as a reference in the GitHub repository linked below. You can check for it in the sectional code. Now, as you can see from the completed file, I have two NPCs, and each NPC has their own dialogue tree. If I talk to my first NPC for the first time, their first dialogue should play, and they should start off by asking, "Hello, adventurer, what do you need?" And our response option should be ask about town, receive quests, and say goodbye. If I choose ask about town, the next branch with the state in progress should play, and the NPC should say, "This town is known for its beautiful gardens and not so friendly NPCs." Depending on my choices, the tree and branches should play the next correct dialogue state. The same goes for my second NPC's tree. So if I talk to my second NPC for the first time, they'll say, "Greetings, traveler, how can I assist you?" And my options would be ask about forest, receive quests, and say goodbye. Okay, so I think you get it by now, but I just want to mention one last thing. You can change the text of both the responses and the dialogue text to be anything you want, and you can add as many responses as you wish per dialogue, as long as you add a corresponding state and a corresponding state dialogue. So you don't only have to have 3 options: continue asking about town, receive quest, and say goodbye. You can have something like, tell me about Mandy, and tell me about Sally, or where are you from? And each of those dialogues should play a next corresponding dialogue. So you'll have a state and a text for all of those options. I hope this makes sense because it is quite a complex system, and when you're working with data files, it's always a bit overwhelming. Please, if you have any questions or confusions, don't hesitate to reach out to me in the comments or via Discord, and I will try and explain it to you as best as I can. We need to move on to our dialog resource. If you can remember from the first video, our dialog resource will load the data from our dialog data file that we just created and pass it to the correct NPC using the NPC ID. So, in our resources/dialog folder, let's create a new script called dialog. It should inherit from the resource object. If you don't know what a resource object is, it is basically a class that is designed to serve as a data container. This data container can then be shared, saved, and reused across the different parts of our game, and we usually assign this resource to nodes via the inspector panel. This means that we can add and manage data via the inspector panel instead of via the code. But for now, just know that we saved our dialog script as a resource type because we will give each of our NPCs a new dialog instance in the inspector panel. This will then allow us to easily load and manage the dialog data and states for each individual NPC. In this script, we'll start off by loading all of our data from our JSON file that we just created, and then we will populate this data into a new dictionary, which will hold all of our dialogues for easy reference. This means that we load our dialogues once instead of having to load and read the JSON file each time we want to access a certain branch or response. From the code, you will see that we use the class name keyword to convert our script into a globally accessible class. This means that we can access the dialog script directly in our other scripts without having to instance it. Now, this is different from an autoload singleton script because autoload singletons are used for global systems and state management, whereas a global class is used for when we want to easily instance and reuse custom nodes. An autoload singleton is always loaded and available everywhere as soon as the game or editor starts up, but a global class is only loaded or made available when it is instanced or referenced in another script or scene. Now, we will also create a function which will pass the correct dialog data to the NPC that is instancing this resource. So, when we instance this resource in our NPC scene, it will only return the dialog data that is assigned to that NPC. So, from this function, you can see that it gets the dialogs associated with each NPC. If we're talking to an NPC that has an invalid ID, meaning it cannot correlate to the dialog data, or they just don't have any dialogs, then we'll return nothing. And that is our dialog resource fully created. Now we can head over to our NPC script and instance this dialog resource when our NPC enters a scene. You'll see that we instance it directly using the class name that we just defined in our dialog object. Now, if you click on your NPC, either via the scene or in the main scene, you will see that we can instance the dialog resource. When you add a new NPC, make sure that they each have a dialog resource assigned to them in the inspector panel. We need to do this so that each NPC can fetch their own unique dialogs. If you click on it, you'll see that we can't add our dialogs via the inspector panel because this resource only fetches the dialogs. It doesn't allow for the creation of them. So now in our NPC script, let's load our dialogs that are associated with this NPC. Okay, so we will have to update our start dialog function to get the data for the NPC from our loaded resource. Later on, we will use this to display our dialogs in our dialog box. So now we've loaded our data and we are getting the data for this NPC. The last thing that we need to do is create the base logic to track and set our dialog states. We'll start by creating the variables that will store our dialog state and the index of our dialog tree. This state is the states that we defined earlier on in our JSON, such as started, in progress, and end. And the index is the ID of our branch that is currently active. So the branch with the ID of NPC11 will have an index of 0, whereas the branch of NPC12 will have an index of 1, and so forth. So now we have a way to store our dialog state and the current branch that we are on. All we need to do now is create a few functions. The first function that we need to create will return the correct dialog based on the state of our dialog and our current branch. In this function, we will start by retrieving the dialog data from our resource, just as we did in our start dialog function. Then we will iterate over this data and return the correct dialog that matches the current state in the tree branch. If no dialog data is found, then we will return nothing. Now that we can get our dialog from the current branch, we also need to create another function which will update the dialog branch index so that we can move on to the next available branch in the tree. This will usually happen when we reach the end of our current dialog branch and we want to move on to the next branch in the tree. In this function, we will simply set the dialog branch index and reset our dialog state. And then finally, we need to create our last function, which will update the current state of our dialog. This will happen when we respond to our NPC. We need to update the state so that the next dialog in the current branch can play. We will stop here for now because if I have to look at one more line of JSON code, my brain will do a backflip.
Yeah, I guess it was your pink hat.
Pink hat? Oh, that's not a hat. That's my brain.
Oh.
So that being said, with our dialog resource and data created, we can now move on to our next component, which is our logic to open and close our dialog UI that we previously created. And we will start with creating our dialog manager. That's it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.